The secret story behind Abraham Lincoln's suspicious death. How could the most wanted man in America, injured and on the run, evade thousands of soldiers for nearly 2 weeks? And what secrets were locked away in a pocket diary that no one wanted you to read? For over 150 years, the death of Abraham Lincoln has been told as a simple story, but hidden evidence, silenced witnesses, and unanswered questions suggest something far more complex. In this video, you'll dig into rare findings and uncover mysteries that history tried to bury. Some of the answers will shock you, but we'll solve those later. What goes through a man's mind after killing a president? Not just any president, but Abraham Lincoln. And not just any man, but John Wilkes Booth. For nearly 2 weeks after the assassination, while wounded and hunted, Booth carried a small diary. In it, he poured out his thoughts, his fears, and his justifications. These weren't courtroom transcripts or secondhand reports. These were his words, written on the run. Let's start with the tone. Booth didn't sound triumphant. He didn't brag about striking down a leader. He sounded desperate, bitter, and at times almost broken. One line reads, "I am here in despair, and why? For doing what Brutus was honored for." He cast himself as a Roman hero, but in the same breath admitted despair. That contradiction is at the heart of his diary. Why would Booth compare himself to Brutus? Because he saw Lincoln as a tyrant, a ruler who had destroyed the South and overstepped the Constitution. Booth believed he was delivering justice, not committing murder. To him, he was a patriot standing against unlawful power. But as the days passed, his words revealed a different picture. He wrote that he was abandoned, with the curse of Cain upon me. Imagine that. Booth didn't feel celebrated. He felt cursed, like the biblical outcast marked for life. That wasn't the vision he expected. He thought the South would cheer him. Instead, many in the South recoiled at his act. The Union called him a monster. Even sympathizers began to distance themselves. Have you ever made a choice you thought would be applauded, only to find you stood alone? That was Booth in those pages. His entries also reveal a man consumed by physical pain. Remember, he had shattered his leg jumping from the balcony after shooting Lincoln. He wrote about the swelling, the throbbing pain, and the endless fatigue of moving through swamps and forests. Hunger gnawed at him. Cold nights tested him. He prayed for relief. In one passage, he begged God for deliverance. Yet even as he prayed, his pride returned. He claimed he was no criminal. He insisted he had acted in defense of liberty. He scolded himself for being misunderstood. The diary reads like a tug-of-war between conscience and conviction. One line pleads for forgiveness. The next line declares glory. And then there's the paranoia. Booth wrote about betrayal. He believed people he trusted had turned on him. "Even by those who once called me friend," he scrawled. Who were these friends? He didn't name them, but the bitterness is clear. That bitterness grew as the chase dragged on. The diary also shows how much Booth thought about performance. Remember, he was an actor before he was an assassin. He described himself almost as if he were still on stage. He quoted plays, invoked history, and shaped his words like dialogue. Killing Lincoln wasn't just a political act to him. It was theater. In his mind, he wasn't just a fugitive. He was a character in a grand drama. But here's the strange part. Even in his own words, Booth admitted misjudgment. He admitted he thought the South would rally. He admitted he expected support that never came. His diary reveals not only his ideology, but also his surprise at how wrong he was. That's what makes it such a rare document. It captures not the legend, but the raw, unraveling man behind it. Later forensic studies of Booth's diary confirmed these entries were authentic. Scientists used infrared imaging to study the ink and impressions. They confirmed his shaky handwriting matched the stress of someone injured and on the move. No hidden codes, no invisible ink, just a wounded man's confession to himself. And yet, even as he confessed despair, he refused to surrender. He wrote, "I have too great a soul to die like a criminal." Think about that. Here's a man who murdered the president, who caused national mourning, and yet he still saw himself as noble. That stubborn pride never left him. What would you have done if you were Booth, cornered by pain, rejected by allies, and condemned by history? Would you admit guilt, or cling to your own story to the end? Booth clung. Every line shows it. He framed himself as a misunderstood hero, not a villain. He pleaded for future generations to see his courage instead of his crime. That's the essence of his diary. It isn't an apology, it's a plea for legacy. It's worth noting how ordinary some entries feel. Between lofty declarations, he scribbled about food, water, and hiding places. He noted rivers, fields, and shadows. He mentioned the weather, the hunger, the thirst. These details remind us this wasn't just ideology. It was survival. He was a man on the run, limping through mud, terrified of every sound. And still, he kept writing. Why? Because he wanted control of the story. He wanted his voice to outlive him. He wanted to tell his side, no matter how history judged him. So what does Booth's diary really show us? It shows us a man divided. One part zealot, convinced he acted for liberty. Another part outcast, broken by regret and fear. One moment bold, the next moment pleading. That contradiction is what makes it so haunting. When we read Booth's diary today, we don't just see an assassin. We see a man wrestling with himself. We see vanity, fear, pride, and desperation tangled together. We see the human mind trying to rewrite history while it's still happening. And maybe that's the most chilling truth. Booth killed Lincoln on stage before hundreds. But in his diary, he was performing for history itself. He wanted the last word. And in a way, he got it. Coming up next, we'll look at who had power over that diary once Booth was gone. The man who controlled the evidence, the trial, and even the story Americans were allowed to hear. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Was he simply protecting the nation, or was he rewriting history? What happens when the most important diary in American history is missing pages, not torn casually, not lost to time, but sliced cleanly with a blade? That's what we find in John Wilkes Booth's pocket diary. The words that remain show his fear, pride, and paranoia, but the missing leaves whisper an even darker story, because someone didn't want us to read them. Let's start with the numbers. Booth's diary wasn't large. It was a small red book, meant more as a calendar than a journal. Yet nearly 18 pages were missing when it reached investigators. Some modern archivists believe even more. Possibly 40 sheets were removed. The stubs prove they once existed. They weren't never there blanks. They were taken out. So who cut them? And when? That's the puzzle. The cuts weren't ragged. They weren't torn by a man in panic. They were clean, straight, and deliberate, as if done with a sharp knife or scissors. Forensic analysts who studied the diary later confirmed this wasn't the work of a fugitive writing by firelight. It was the work of someone with steady hands after the fact. Now here's where it gets even stranger. Booth was killed on April 26, 1865. His diary was recovered on his body and taken to Washington. Who received it? The War Department. And for nearly 2 years, nothing was said about it. When the diary finally appeared during congressional hearings in 1867, members of Congress immediately noticed the missing pages. Why would a key piece of evidence, tied directly to the murder of a president, be hidden for so long, and then appear incomplete? The official line was simple. Booth must have removed the pages himself. But as we've seen, the cuts tell a different story. Modern imaging techniques have been used on the diary. Infrared and ultraviolet light were applied to check for invisible ink, erased words, or hidden impressions. The scans found faint marks on the remaining stubs, showing that writing once pressed against them. That's proof those pages weren't blank. They carried words now lost. So what was written on them? No one knows for certain. And that's why speculation has flourished for over a century. Some historians argue the missing leaves might have named names. Powerful individuals who supported Booth or sympathized with his cause. Imagine if Southern financiers, Confederate agents, or even figures in Washington had been implicated. Publishing that in 1865 could have torn the fragile nation apart. Others suggest the missing pages contained nothing more than rambling notes, directions, contacts, or personal reflections. If that were true, though, why remove them at all? Why risk suspicion by leaving behind cleanly cut stubs? Have you ever noticed how silence often speaks louder than words? In this case, the missing pages shout. Archivists today continue to catalog the diary carefully. It rests in the collection of Ford's Theater Museum, accessible to researchers but handled under strict conditions. Scholars have debated not only the content of the missing pages, but also who had the motive to remove them. The suspects list is short. government officials with access to evidence in 1865. And this is where the story touches power. The diary went directly to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Stanton oversaw the investigation, the manhunt, and the tribunal. If the pages were removed after Booth's death, it would have been under his watch. Was it Stanton himself or someone on his staff? We can't prove it, but the timing raises eyebrows. Now think about this. The missing pages weren't revealed until questions were asked. Congress pushed for answers. Only then did Stanton's office hand over the diary. By that point, the damage was already done. Modern historians disagree on how much this matters. Some say we shouldn't build legends around missing leaves. Others argue the absence itself changes everything. After all, if you discovered missing pages in the personal writings of a presidential assassin, wouldn't you wonder why? Let's pause here. What would you have done if you held Booth's diary in your hands in 1865, released it in full, no matter what it said, or trimmed it down, believing some truths were too dangerous to reveal? The mystery deepens when we consider technology today. With DNA tests and forensic imaging advancing every year, researchers have asked whether more traces, ink, fingerprints, even microscopic fibers, could still be pulled from the diary. So far, no full re-examination has been permitted. The artifact remains tightly controlled, its secrets still locked away. And here's a chilling possibility. If the missing pages ever surface, whether in a private collection or an archive, they could upend how we understand Lincoln's assassination. Were Booth's motives really his alone? Or was he a pawn in a larger web, erased from history by the snip of scissors? That's the power of those missing leaves. They are not just scraps of paper. They represent the gap between the story we've been told and the story that might have been. What if the man responsible for investigating Lincoln's murder also had the power to control every piece of evidence, every headline, and every voice allowed to speak? That man was Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. To understand the mystery of Lincoln's death, you have to understand Stanton, because nothing reached the public without passing through his hands. Let's start on the night of April 14, 1865. Lincoln had just been carried from Ford's Theater to a boarding house across the street. While doctors worked to keep him alive, Stanton arrived and took command. He ordered the streets patrolled, the city sealed, and couriers sent racing with news. From that moment on, he wasn't just managing a crisis. He was controlling the narrative. Why does that matter? Because in times of chaos, the man who controls information controls history. Booth was on the run, but Stanton quickly cast him as the lone villain. The message was clear: one actor, one gun, one crime. Any whispers of wider plots or powerful allies were brushed aside, and with Stanton in charge of the War Department, few dared to question him. Now look at how he handled evidence. Booth's belongings, letters, and diary all went to Stanton's office. Nothing was shown to the public until Stanton decided it was time. Even Congress had to wait. That meant Stanton could filter, withhold, or frame the story however he wanted. Have you ever wondered why some pieces of evidence surface quickly while others gather dust? Often it depends on who benefits from delay. Then came the trial of Booth's alleged co-conspirators. Stanton didn't send them to civilian court. Instead, he insisted on a military tribunal. Why a military trial? Because it gave him more control. Rules were looser, secrecy was easier, and the outcome could be shaped. 8 suspects were tried, 4 were hanged, and the proceedings were shielded from public scrutiny. Modern legal scholars look back and question whether Stanton overstepped the Constitution. The war had ended. Washington was not under martial law, and the accused were civilians. By pushing them into a military court, Stanton guaranteed a quicker, harsher process with fewer rights for the defense. Some historians argue it was justice rushed. Others argue it was justice manipulated. And then there was the press. Stanton kept newspapers on a short leash. He fed them official bulletins, crafted to project confidence and certainty. The public heard what he wanted them to hear, no more and no less. That tight control kept rumors down, but it also silenced questions. Let's pause here. Have you ever noticed how controlling the story can be just as powerful as controlling the facts? Stanton understood that better than anyone. Critics say he had more than patriotism on his mind. Lincoln had been pushing a soft peace with the South, with malice toward none, with charity for all. Stanton and the radical Republicans wanted harsher Reconstruction, punishing the South and keeping federal control strong. With Lincoln gone, Stanton's allies shaped policy their way. Was that coincidence or advantage? Theories have long swirled that Stanton may have allowed certain details to be suppressed. Did he cut pages from Booth's diary? Did he silence inconvenient witnesses? We may never know, but we do know he alone had the opportunity. Even Booth's death was managed under Stanton's shadow. When the fugitive was finally trapped in a Virginia barn, soldiers shot him before he could be taken alive. Stanton confirmed the body as Booth's, ordered it hidden, and restricted public access. No open viewing, no photographs released. The public simply had to trust his word. Would you have trusted him, or would you have wanted proof? Modern historians remain divided on Stanton. Some argue he saved the country by imposing order when it was most fragile. Others argue he abused power to protect himself and shape history. Both views agree on one thing. Without Stanton, the story of Lincoln's assassination would not look the same. Think of it this way. Booth pulled the trigger, but Stanton pulled the strings afterward. He determined what was evidence and what was rumor, who lived and who died, what Americans were told and what they weren't. He was not on the stage at Ford's Theater, but he was the director of the drama that followed. And here's the question that lingers. Was Stanton simply protecting the Union from panic or protecting secrets from exposure? The fact that we still ask that question more than 150 years later shows how deeply his choices shaped the legacy of Lincoln's death. Coming up next, we leave Washington and follow Booth himself. For 12 days, a man with a shattered leg managed to evade thousands of soldiers across Maryland and Virginia. Was it brilliant planning, pure luck, or help from people in powerful places? That's the mystery of Booth's escape network, and it's one of the most baffling chapters in this story. How does a man with a broken leg stay ahead of the largest manhunt in American history? For 12 days, John Wilkes Booth limped through fields, swamps, and villages while thousands of Union troops searched for him. He was injured, hungry, and recognizable, yet somehow he kept slipping away. Let's start with the night of April 14, 1865. After shooting Lincoln, Booth leapt to the stage, shattering his leg. He staggered out the back door of Ford's Theater and mounted a waiting horse. Already, the escape was in motion. That horse wasn't left by chance. It was part of the plan. Booth rode through the dark streets of Washington, joined by David Harold, a young accomplice. Together they crossed the Navy Yard Bridge into Maryland. Soldiers at the checkpoint let them through. Odd, considering the city was already on alert. Why weren't they stopped? Was it luck, confusion, or something more? By dawn, Booth and Harold arrived at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd. Mudd splinted Booth's leg and gave them a place to rest. The visit was no accident. Booth already knew Mudd from earlier meetings. This was a planned medical stop, not a desperate knock on a stranger's door. From there, Booth and Harold pushed south into the swamps of Maryland. They hid in a pine thicket for several days, aided by Confederate sympathizers who brought food and news. The swamps were thick, mosquito-ridden, and nearly impossible to penetrate without guidance. Yet Booth's helpers knew the terrain. They had been part of secret Confederate smuggling routes during the war. Now think about this. Booth was the most wanted man in America, his description plastered everywhere, his face well known. Yet he was fed, sheltered, and hidden by civilians who risked their lives to protect him. That doesn't happen without loyalty and preparation. On April 21st, Booth and Harold crossed the Potomac River. Their guide was Thomas Jones, a former Confederate spy. Jones gave them a boat, instructed them on the currents, and watched as they rowed across under cover of night. He admitted later that he knew exactly who Booth was, and still helped him. Even more surprising, Jones was never punished. He confessed his role years later in print, and nothing happened to him. Why? Why would a man who aided Lincoln's assassin walk free? Was it mercy? Or was it convenience? Once across into Virginia, Booth and Harold continued south, relying on safe houses and sympathetic farmers. They posed as wounded soldiers, inventing names and excuses. One farmer, Richard Garrett, eventually gave them shelter at his tobacco farm near Port Royal. Garrett thought Booth was just a crippled Confederate soldier trying to get home. He let him stay in the barn. But Booth lingered too long. By April 25th, Union cavalry had tracked him to Garrett's farm. Early on April 26th, they surrounded the barn. Harold surrendered, but Booth refused. He shouted that he would not be taken alive. The soldiers set the barn on fire. In the chaos, a shot rang out. Booth was struck in the neck and dragged out, dying hours later. He was just 26. That's the official story, but let's look closer. For nearly 2 weeks, Booth slipped through a net of 2,000 soldiers searching for him. He rode past checkpoints, hid in known Confederate zones, and crossed a heavily patrolled river. Each time, he had the right helpers, the right timing, the right luck. Was this simply the genius of a desperate man? Or was someone making sure the path stayed open? Modern historians have used maps, GPS, and land records to trace Booth's escape in detail. The routes he chose weren't random. They were known smuggling paths used during the war. His ability to find shelter and food shows he tapped into an organized network. Booth wasn't improvising. He was following a plan designed before the shot was fired. And here's a chilling possibility. If Booth had that much support, who else knew? Was the network limited to Confederate diehards in Maryland and Virginia? Or did it stretch into places we don't expect, possibly even into Washington itself? We'll never know for sure, but the fact remains. Booth's escape lasted far longer than most experts believe it should have. A wounded actor outmaneuvered a massive army. That either proves his cunning, or it suggests he had protection from more than just farmers in the swamps. Let's pause. If you were Booth, would you have risked this escape without knowing you had friends waiting down the road? Of course not. And that's what makes this so suspicious. Even his end raises questions. The barn at Garrett's farm was torched, leaving Booth with no way out. He begged to die as a soldier, not as a criminal. His last recorded words were, "Useless, useless," but some present swore he said nothing at all. The confusion over his death only adds to the uncertainty about his escape. So what does Booth's 12-day flight really tell us? It tells us he wasn't just a rogue actor acting alone. He had a network of helpers ready to move, ready to hide, ready to risk everything. And whether that network was simply loyal Confederates or something larger, it worked. Coming up next, we'll zoom in on one of those helpers, Dr. Samuel Mudd. Was he an innocent country doctor caught in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or was he part of Booth's carefully prepared plan from the start? What would you do if a stranger knocked on your door at dawn, bleeding and in need of help? Most of us would help without hesitation. But what if that stranger was John Wilkes Booth, the man who had just killed Abraham Lincoln? That was the dilemma of Dr. Samuel Mudd, a country physician in southern Maryland. His role has been debated for more than 150 years. Was he a good Samaritan trapped in history's shadow? Or was he a willing ally in Booth's escape? Let's start with the facts. Just hours after Lincoln was shot, Booth and his accomplice David Harold rode to Dr. Mudd's farm. Booth's leg was shattered from his leap at Ford's Theater. Mudd treated the injury, built a splint, and allowed the men to rest. He even arranged for them to stay overnight. That much is undisputed. The controversy begins with what happened next. Mudd did not report the visit immediately. Instead, he waited more than 24 hours before telling authorities that 2 strangers had come to his house. And when he did, he failed to mention Booth by name. By then, Booth was long gone. Why delay? Why omit the name of a man he must have recognized? Mudd later claimed he didn't know it was Booth. He said the assassin's appearance was different, disguised with a beard, exhausted, and injured. He argued he had only treated a wounded traveler, but records show Mudd had already met Booth months before. Booth had visited southern Maryland in 1864 while plotting Lincoln's kidnapping. During that time, he was introduced to Mudd by a mutual acquaintance. The two even spent a night together at Mudd's farm. Could Mudd really have forgotten his face? Booth was a famous actor, his features known across the country. To many, Mudd's claim of ignorance feels thin. Have you ever met someone unforgettable, then been asked later if you recognize them? Could you honestly say no? At his trial, prosecutors hammered this point. They argued Mudd knew exactly who he was helping. They said the doctor was part of Booth's support network, ready to give aid when the time came. The tribunal agreed, sentencing Mudd to life in prison for aiding and abetting Booth. But the case doesn't end there. Modern historians have revisited the evidence, and some believe Mudd was unfairly treated. They point out that his delay in reporting could have been hesitation or fear, not conspiracy. After all, helping a wounded stranger was part of his duty as a physician. If he had refused, he might have been accused of cruelty. Letters from Mudd's family show that they fought for decades to clear his name. They insisted he was a scapegoat, punished because the government wanted to send a message that anyone connected to Booth would pay a price. In prison, Mudd earned respect for his medical skills. When a yellow fever outbreak struck Fort Jefferson in Florida, he cared for both inmates and guards, saving many lives. His heroism led President Andrew Johnson to pardon him in 1869, after just 4 years in prison. Supporters point to this as evidence of his good character. But does good character erase suspicion? That's the heart of the debate. Modern scholars have also examined overlooked details. One letter written by a fellow prisoner suggests Mudd privately admitted knowing Booth. Another record shows Mudd misled investigators about how quickly Booth left his farm. These pieces of evidence hint that he may have been more involved than he claimed. Yet none of it proves direct participation in the assassination plot. At worst, Mudd may have been guilty of aiding Booth after the fact. At best, he was a frightened doctor caught in a storm far larger than himself. Let's pause here. What would you have done if Booth had arrived at your door that night, help him out of medical duty, or risk your life refusing? The choice isn't simple. Over time, Mudd's legacy has softened. His descendants petitioned Congress in the early 2000s to declare him innocent. The resolution failed, but it showed how deeply this question still matters. Was Mudd a traitor or a victim of circumstance? Modern legal scholars often use Mudd's case as an example of how wartime tribunals blur the line between justice and vengeance. In the rush to punish, the tribunal may have judged him more harshly than the evidence allowed, but others argue his lies and delays prove he was no innocent bystander. What seems clear is that Booth trusted Mudd enough to go directly to his farm after the assassination. That suggests at least prior familiarity. Whether it was casual acquaintance or deeper cooperation is still debated. And that's what makes Dr. Mudd's story so compelling. He was not in Ford's Theater. He never fired a weapon, yet history tied his name forever to Lincoln's death. Today, his farmhouse is a museum, drawing visitors who want to stand where Booth's leg was set. Some leave convinced of his innocence. Others leave convinced of his guilt. The debate endures. So what's the truth? The evidence points both ways. He was a doctor who saved lives, but also a man who lied about a visitor he knew. He was a healer, but possibly also a helper. He may have been both. Coming up next, we'll move from the farmhouse back to Ford's Theater, because several people claim to hear something that doesn't fit the official story. They swore there were not one, but 2 gunshots. Why was their testimony ignored? That's the mystery of the echoes at Ford's Theater, and it may reveal more than we think. What if the official story of Lincoln's assassination isn't the only one? We all know Booth fired a single shot into the president's head at Ford's Theater. That's the version carved into history. But several witnesses that night claimed they heard something different. 2 gunshots, not one, and their voices were quickly dismissed. Let's start with one of those men. William Ferguson, a stagehand at Ford's Theater, was working behind the scenes when the fatal moment came. In sworn statements later, he insisted he heard 2 distinct reports, separated by just a few seconds. Not echoes, not confusion, but 2 shots. He rushed toward the commotion, only to be told by an army officer not to repeat what he had heard. There was 1 shot, he was told, and don't say otherwise. Why would an eyewitness be silenced like that? If the truth is simple, there's no reason to hide it. And Ferguson wasn't alone. At least 3 other accounts from that night mentioned 2 gunshots. Some patrons sitting in the balcony swore they heard a second report, softer and slightly delayed. A doorman said he thought 2 pistols had gone off. Yet when the investigation was compiled, all of those statements vanished. Only the single-shot version survived. Now, defenders of the official account point to acoustics. Ford's Theater was packed that night. Nearly 1,700 people filling the hall. The laughter of the audience, the echo of the walls, and the confusion of panic could easily have made 1 pistol shot sound like 2. Add to that the screams and shouts that followed, and memories could blur. Modern sound analysis supports this view. A single shot could have been misinterpreted by multiple ears in the chaos. But here's the question. If it was only confusion, why did investigators actively suppress those testimonies? Why not simply include them as contradictory accounts? Instead, they were brushed aside, erased from the official record. Let's pause. Have you ever told your version of an event only to be told you're wrong? Even when you're certain, that's how these witnesses must have felt. Medical evidence, of course, supports the official version. Lincoln had only 1 wound. A single bullet to the back of the head, fired at point-blank range. There was no second slug, no second wound. That fact is clear, but if that's the case, what explains the multiple testimonies? Some historians suggest a second pistol may have been fired accidentally, perhaps by Booth himself in the struggle, or by another conspirator in the shadows of the theater. If that happened, the bullet may have embedded harmlessly in wood or plaster. No such evidence was ever presented. Still, the idea lingers because the witnesses were silenced rather than heard. Another possibility is psychological. In moments of shock, the brain sometimes doubles sounds, creating a false impression of multiple reports. Modern neuroscience confirms this happens often in traumatic events. Could this explain why several people swore they heard two? Perhaps. Yet the most suspicious element remains the handling of those statements. If they were simply errors of memory, they could have been included and explained. Instead, they were buried. That act alone keeps the suspicion alive. Later forensic reconstructions used ballistics and medical analysis to prove that Lincoln's wound could only have come from Booth's single Derringer pistol. No evidence supports a second shooter. Most scholars agree there was one bullet, one gunman, but that hasn't stopped alternative theories from spreading. Because the very idea of a second shot hints at something larger, a conspiracy involving more than just Booth. And that possibility, even if unlikely, was dangerous for officials trying to stabilize a grieving nation. Stanton and the War Department wanted certainty, not confusion. They wanted the public to believe the story was simple and closed. Have you ever noticed how messy details are often cleaned up when governments tell their stories? History prefers clean lines, not jagged edges. And so, the testimony of Ferguson and others was erased. The official story remained one gun, one shot, one assassin. But beneath the surface, the echoes still linger. Today, historians acknowledge the reports of a second gunshot, but generally explain them as mistakes of memory or acoustics. Still, the way those voices were suppressed raises questions about what else may have been trimmed from the record. The truth is likely this: Booth fired once, and that shot killed Lincoln. The rest was confusion, panic, and memory playing tricks. Yet the witnesses who swore otherwise remind us that history is never just one version. It's many voices, and sometimes the loudest one is the one that gets written down. So what do we make of the second shot? Perhaps not a literal second bullet, but a symbol of how much was filtered and managed after Lincoln's death. A symbol of how Stanton's War Department shaped not only what Americans believed, but what they were even allowed to hear. Coming up next, we'll turn to Booth's end. The moment his body was dragged from a burning barn, quickly hidden, and buried in secret. But here's the question that still haunts historians. Was the corpse really Booth's? Or did the assassin escape, leaving the country chasing shadows? That's the final mystery we'll explore. What if the man buried as John Wilkes Booth wasn't Booth at all? That's the question that has haunted historians, descendants, and conspiracy theorists for more than a century. Because from the moment Booth's body was dragged from that Virginia barn, doubt began to grow. Was the assassin really dead, or did he slip away while someone else took his place? Let's go back to April 26, 1865. After 12 days on the run, Booth was cornered in a barn on Richard Garrett's farm. Soldiers set the barn ablaze to flush him out. A gunshot rang out, and Booth was struck in the neck. He was pulled from the burning structure and died hours later. He was just 26. That's the official story. But here's the problem. Booth's death was never shown to the public. No photographs of the body were released. No open casket. His family wasn't allowed to see him. His remains were hidden away under a military prison floor, in a secret grave marked only by officials who served Stanton. The most hated man in America vanished into the ground, unseen by ordinary eyes. Would you believe it without proof? Identification relied on a handful of details: a tattoo of Booth's initials on his hand, a scar on his neck, the broken leg splinted by Dr. Mudd. Fellow officers and acquaintances confirmed it was him. Case closed, they said. But years later, undertakers and even some family members questioned the match. One said the corpse looked too old. Another claimed the hair color was wrong. Booth's own mother reportedly wept in doubt, unsure it was really her son. And then the rumors started. In small towns and newspapers, stories spread that Booth had escaped, that the man shot in Garrett's barn was a decoy, that Booth had fled west or south, living under false names. One of the most enduring legends pointed to Oklahoma, where a man named David E. George committed suicide in 1903. On his deathbed, he allegedly confessed, "I am John Wilkes Booth." The body of George was embalmed and put on display, toured across the country as the man who killed Lincoln. Thousands came to see it. Some swore the resemblance was uncanny. Was it a gruesome carnival trick or a glimpse of the truth? Historians remain skeptical. The manhunt was thorough, they argue, and the identification in 1865 was solid. But the lack of transparency fuels suspicion. Why hide the body? Why deny the family access? Why not release a single photo to silence rumors forever? The story doesn't end in the 19th century. In the 1990s, Booth's descendants petitioned to exhume his grave in Baltimore for DNA testing. They wanted closure. They wanted science to prove once and for all that the remains were truly Booth's. A Maryland court denied the request. Officials claimed exhumation was unnecessary and disruptive, but to the family, the denial only deepened suspicion. At the same time, researchers turned to another option: Booth's cervical vertebrae, preserved in the National Museum of Health and Medicine. Scientists proposed extracting DNA from the bone and comparing it to Booth family descendants. But the museum refused, citing preservation concerns. Once again, the test was blocked. Have you ever noticed how unanswered questions only grow louder when answers are withheld? That's exactly what happened here. Modern forensic experts say DNA testing could easily solve the mystery today. With advanced technology, even degraded remains could be matched to living relatives. If the bones in the museum or the grave in Baltimore truly belonged to Booth, science would prove it. If not, history would be rewritten, yet the tests have never been allowed. Why? Officials say there's no reason to disturb settled history. Skeptics say it's fear of what the results might reveal. So where does that leave us? On one side, the weight of official evidence. The tattoo, the scar, the broken leg, and multiple identifications in 1865. On the other side, the secrecy, the missing photographs, the blocked exhumations, and the persistent legends of Booth's escape. Think about it. If Booth really did slip away, it would mean the greatest manhunt in American history ended in failure, and that those in power covered it up. That's a possibility too great for many to accept. And yet, the questions remain. Was the body in Garrett's barn truly John Wilkes Booth? Or did the assassin of Abraham Lincoln live on in hiding, laughing at the world that thought him dead? Until DNA testing is done, we can't know for certain. And perhaps that's the most haunting part of all. A century and a half later, the final chapter of Lincoln's assassination is still unwritten. So what do you believe? Was the assassin buried in Baltimore? Or is history built on a case of mistaken identity? One thing is certain. The mystery of Booth's body proves that even when the gun has fired and the manhunt is over, the questions never die.